Hi, good morning to those of you in the West and good afternoon further east. Thank you for joining us for a conversation with Microsoft CTO Kevin Scott and New York Times bestselling author J.D. Vance, whose Hillbilly Elegy will soon be a film directed by Ron Howard. J.D. is also an advisor to the Rise of the Rest seed funds. Kevin and J.D., welcome. My name is Greg Shaw, and I will help us navigate this online conversation today. I would say virtual in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, but virtual and remote, sadly, are reality today. On behalf of everyone at Microsoft, we hope each of you today is well. This is a somber time, but we hope this conversation is informative. A few housekeeping notes, and then we'll get into the conversation. We ask you to bear with us during this live event, as all of you are sheltering in place. All of us are as well, in our homes, or perhaps more precisely in our closets and bedrooms, and may have to deal with network dropouts or surprise appearances from children and possibly pets. We will be taking questions, so please begin now to submit your questions via the Q&A sidebar that you'll see here in the Teams Live event. It's on the upper right side of your screen. Please feel also free to tweet your question if you'd like on Twitter using the hashtag #ReprogrammingLive. Now, before I turn it over to Kevin and JD, let me also thank some of our partners today, HarperCollins Business, our publisher, GeekWire, which has been a terrific media partner for us, the company community, a curated collection of New York City's top startups and entrepreneurs, the Jefferson Forge in Iowa, hello to our friends in Iowa, the University of Virginia Computer Science Department, Web Investment Network, the Ford Foundation, Hudson Union Society, the 92nd Street Y, DigiDems and their partner organizations, Aspen Institute, which will share and record the video afterward, Microsoft Alumni Association, and Microsoft US and Canada Consumer Marketing Customer Networks. Kevin, beginning tomorrow, you will also, in addition to being CTO, become a published author when Harper Business releases Reprogramming the American Dream, From Rural America to Silicon Valley, Making AI Serve Us All. JD wrote the foreword for your book, and it looks like you're joining us. I don't know if others can see it, but they will soon, from your lab in Northern California. Are those 3D printers that I see in the background?
They are. So I've got 3 of them in the background. If folks can see. And you know, it's sort of interesting. I think that 3D printers are part of this resurgence in agile manufacturing and just sort of the rapid progression of manufacturing technology that we've seen over the past handful of years. So like they're incredibly useful devices. Like we use them for everything here in the lab, and it's just amazing to see what sorts of innovative things people are putting them to use for in a bunch of different like development and production applications in manufacturing.
I gather from an earlier conversation that to your left is a less orderly look with metal shavings and wood shop implements. Tell us the origin of your desire to write this book, and if you could maybe summarize the book's premise.
Yeah, I've been really fortunate to have an interesting career in computing, and for the past 16 years or so, I've been like fairly actively involved in the development of AI machine learning technologies. The first big project that I did after I left academia to take a job in industry was a machine learning project, and machine learning and AI have been big parts of everything that I've done since, including it's probably 80% of my job over the past 3 years as CTO of Microsoft. Given all of this work that I've done, I had a preconceived set of notions about how AI was going to impact the future of work, like the impact it was going to have on jobs, the uses to which it was going to be put. And it struck me that the conversation about AI was a lot more complicated than the reductive things that we were talking about in the press and in the public, where things were either being portrayed too optimistically or too pessimistically from my point of view and opinion. And so, as you well know, like you and I started chatting, I guess, 2.5 years ago. I think it's right about the time that work on the book started. And like one of the very first things that we did was take a trip home to Virginia to see how people in my hometown were using technology and what it might be like for them as AI became a bigger and bigger part of the technology equation. And I had this really big aha moment where I was sort of reminded at how ingenious and industrious these folks were in these rural communities. Like we saw 3 different businesses over the course of 2 days, either run or being sort of substantially operated by people that I grew up with. And they were already using technology in a bunch of really sophisticated ways. And it was very obvious from those just sort of 3 encounters that we had, that all of these companies were poised to take advantage of AI as a tool. And like that's sort of one of the points of the book, is to just sort of remind people that AI is a tool, like perhaps one of the most powerful tools that humans have ever invented. And that as a tool, when put into the hands of people who are like very clever and industrious, who have problems that they're trying to solve, like it's going to let them do amazing things. So that's the whole point of the book. It's about this observation that that this powerful technology can and should be made available to everyone, so that everyone has an opportunity to use it to build businesses, to create opportunity for themselves, their businesses, and their communities.
Great. Well, JD, welcome to the program. You wrote the foreword for the book, and I wonder if you might share with us your there's a terrific story in the book about the 2 of you traveling together in Memphis as part of looking at entrepreneurs and startups across the country. Why'd you write the foreword? And maybe also tell us a little bit about how things are going with the Rise of the Rest Fund.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, and it's great to be part of the conversation here. I mean, I wrote the foreword to the book because I thought that it was an interesting book, and that people would read it, and maybe if I gave a little bit of an endorsement, it might be helpful and might help start a little bit of a conversation. My basic reaction to the book, and I think I come at this from a pretty similar place as Kevin, is you have this broad narrative in the country that AI is going to be incredibly disruptive, right? And that's one of those buzzwords that's always a little bit useful to unpack. I think typically what people mean is that AI, artificial intelligence, is going to come along and basically take a lot of jobs away from people, that it's going to make previous jobs superfluous. It's going to take rote tasks and make them easier to perform with automation. And that consequently, it's going to cause this sort of apocalypse of joblessness all across the country. And I was sort of sympathetic to that, I think, a few years ago. I maybe even said that in the foreword. I don't remember exactly what I wrote, but my sense is that Kevin and I were somewhat similar in our views that this was probably going to be a bad thing for the broad middle and working class of the country. And the more I dived into the data, and the more I sort of looked at what was actually going on, the more I started to question that narrative. And it's clear that I think this book is coming from a similar place, to where it recognizes that there will be some problems associated with AI, but it's not quite as pessimistic, I think, as the conventional wisdom that AI is just going to destroy all these jobs. And I think, one anecdote that illustrates this relatively well, and I sometimes talk about this, is, in the 1970s, the advent of the ATM, the automated teller machine, meant that a lot of what your average brick and mortar bank employee did was no longer strictly necessary, that their day-to-day job was now being performed by this machine. It's sort of a classic example of automation. And yet today there are more people working in brick and mortar banks than there were when the ATM, first came to be sort of broadly used by consumers. And I think that, on the one hand, yeah, automation can sort of eliminate or at least change a lot of jobs, but in the process, it can also make people more productive and efficient. It can take tasks that maybe took a lot of time. It can take those away from people and allow them to focus on more high value added things. And it doesn't always have to be sort of the job killer that people assume that it's going to be. I'm, on a sort of broad scale, I'm somewhat skeptical of how close we are to self-driving cars. My sense is the technology still has a lot of development before we get there. Some of the more optimistic predictions in the mid 2000s that it would be sort of unnecessary to have a driver's license by 2015 or 2020 clearly haven't proven themselves out. But I think even if you have something like full self-driving cars, it's going to enable a lot of activities and consequently a lot of jobs, a lot of economic productivity that wasn't previously available. And I just think it's important for us to both recognize that AI can be disruptive, but at the same time, realize that people doing more with less, which is really what technology is, does raise productivity. And so long as we're smart about it, can raise overall living standards in the process.
Yeah, I think the point about the self-driving cars is a really interesting one, because one of the things that I talk about in the book is that there are these things that we struggle with in society that are zero sum by nature. So we have limited resources or a bunch of constraints that dictate who has access to what, and like some of those conversations can become super contentious because they're about dividing the slices of a fixed pie. And the things that changes zero sum games into non-zero sum ones that can create abundance and relax constraints are usually technologies, and like self-driving cars are like a good example. So it will absolutely change the way that certain businesses work, provided that we can work all of the kinks in the technology out. And I sort of share some of your concerns that like fully 100% general purpose self-driving cars is probably a little bit further out than we thought a handful of years ago. But there are narrower applications. Like there's this company in Silicon Valley called Niro that is building unmanned delivery drones, and so they're cars that don't have a human driver in them at all. They are used to like go pick up your groceries or your prescription from the drugstore and then take them to you. They can, sort of batch up deliveries from a bunch of different places. And because they don't have a driver, they have a whole different set of safety capabilities than a normal self-driving car would. So, if they get themselves into trouble, they can just sort of pull over onto the side of the road. They can stop long enough to have a human take over the driving process. And I sort of think about my 90-year-old grandmother who lives in rural central Virginia, who, is very fortunate to still be independent. She lives by herself in the country and she can still drive, but the day is coming when she will no longer be able to safely drive. And then the question becomes, how does she get her groceries? How does she get her prescriptions? Like, how does she continue to live an independent life? And she, in that part of the country, like there is no Uber, there is no Lyft, there isn't enough density there to like make those businesses make sense. And these unmanned autonomous delivery vehicles might be something that could help her live an independent life. And like that's, I think, the things that we ought to think about. Like whenever there's a tool like this, there's good and there's bad, and like we just have to sort of make sure that we're getting the balance right.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think one other just data point to throw out there to try to, I think, quantify what's going on is, when we talk about job market or labor market disruption, I think one of the more useful metrics is occupational churn. So how many new types of occupations are coming online minus how many types of old occupations have gone offline. And you sort of net that to get a sense of, how much real churn is there in the labor force. And what is true sort of counterintuitively, this is one of the main reasons why I became, a little bit less worried about AI's, effect on the labor market, is that we actually have much less occupational churn now than we did in the 1950s or 60s. And so if we think of Kevin's grandma, yeah, when you have a lot more automation, you certainly have some disruption in the jobs that people do, but it enables all of these capabilities that both create jobs on the one hand and then enable people to live better lives on the other hand. And it's important not to lose sight when worried about disruption of the fact that these things do have real upsides. And if we don't have enough, we don't have enough technological progress, we don't have growth, we don't have people living better and healthier lives. It's just very hard to sort of sustain improved living standards if you're technologically stagnant.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that you and I both share a passion for is just sort of access. And like the world that I want to help us avoid is one where all of the tools are concentrated in like a small population of creators, and that all capital is concentrated in this small handful of places. It's wonderful that we have Silicon Valley and the Puget Sound and Boston and New York City and San Diego and all of these urban innovation centers that are like vibrant economies and brilliant people creating so many things. But we have brilliant creators and really fantastic entrepreneurs everywhere, and like we need to make sure that tools like AI are accessible. And I think there's an argument to be made that they are becoming increasingly accessible. We also need to make sure that capital is flowing to the right places and that we're making smart policy decisions to make sure that everybody has a chance to participate in the economy of the future.
Let me ask JD, pick up on that question. Also remind our audience, thank you all for joining us. We would love to see your questions. If you'll go into the chat function on the right side of your screen, or tweet us a question using the hashtag #ReprogrammingLive. I was about a week behind you, I think, JD. I was with a bunch of startups and entrepreneurs in Oklahoma City, and they were looking forward to the Rise the Rest seed fund coming, probably as a result of coronavirus. You may or may not have made it there, but tell us a little bit about, after publishing Hillbilly Elegy and getting involved with Steve Case and others in the Rise the Rest seed funds. How are you learning about some of those opportunities, and how are things going with that?
Well, yeah, I think they're going very well. I mean, to Kevin's point, there is a lot of innovation, a lot of exciting stuff going on outside of the coast. There are a couple of separate reasons why you might not hear as much about it. Obviously, it's not as concentrated, it's not as networked, there isn't quite as much density. And there also is an access to capital problem. I mean, we've seen certainly a number of companies that I think if they existed in Silicon Valley would be a lot more interesting to investors. We've heard from investors that they're sometimes unwilling to join the board of a company unless they can drive to that company or maybe even bike to that company. And so there are disadvantages, I think, not to being in Silicon Valley, but they're not disadvantages that are unsolvable. I think they're quite solvable. The way that I often think about the sort of outside of the coast innovation, I really think of, there's of course Silicon Valley, there's the Cambridge area, Boston, heavily biotech and a lot of other innovation, and of course New York City, and then there are a few others like Seattle, LA. Beyond that, everything else to me, what makes it so interesting is not primarily that it's not in Silicon Valley. It's that very often these companies are innovating in sectors that don't have a lot of touch points in Silicon Valley. And so if you think about agricultural technology, it actually makes sense to build an ag tech business in a place like St. Louis, where you're close to some of the big players in that space. Or if you're building an insurance tech company, obviously there's a lot of cool stuff in Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of reason to be close to Columbus, Ohio, where there are a lot of really interesting things going on in financial services. And so where I see the most promise in ex-Silicon Valley entrepreneurship and innovation is the marriage between a particular geographic location and a particular sectoral expertise. And my hope, having been very influenced by folks like Tyler Cowen and Peter Thiel, who write a lot about the fact that we've had a lot of innovation in the world of bits, software, IT, consumer internet, and so forth, but not as much innovation in the world of atoms, is that if you get outside of Silicon Valley, there's a little bit more innovation in the world of atoms than you might see inside, and that's something that's both exciting to me as an investor, but again, I think is necessary to actually improve living standards for the whole country over the long term.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we saw when you and I were together in Memphis with Steve was like just an amazing set of entrepreneurs building a bunch of ag tech stuff, like a lot of sort of drones for delivering agricultural chemicals to crops in ways that are less wasteful of water and more environmentally friendly than traditional irrigation and fertilization techniques. A bunch of stuff with autonomous robotic vehicles for doing a bunch of farm tasks, and it's like really interesting to see. I see very little of that happening inside of like Silicon Valley proper. Like we do a little bit, with our Farm Beats program at Microsoft Research, where we're trying to build a bunch of digital technologies to help improve crop productivity. And a bunch of those efforts are like targeted at making precision agriculture available to the developing world and to small independent farmers. But like that stuff can have such an enormous amount of impact, where it just strikes me that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit.
Kevin, one of the things that you write about in the book, as you thought more about your home community, are jobs of the future and opportunities for lower skill workers. You imagine this company that you might create of data labelers and people who are doing data training. Talk a little bit about how you see jobs of the future developing for people outside of Silicon Valley.
Well, I think it's sort of hard to predict exactly which jobs are going to exist as a consequence of the development of AI. Like we can probably put a pretty firm stake in the ground that lots and lots of new professions are going to exist as a consequence of things that we're going to do in the future. But knowing exactly what those things are is sort of interesting. Like I know, for instance, that first machine learning project that I did back in 2004, when I left academia, at the time, like there was no such thing as a data scientist. There was no such thing as the cloud. Like those were two terms that hadn't even been coined yet. And now, like, we have many jobs like data scientists and like data science related jobs that have educational programs, training, people are explicitly hiring for them. They're growing very quickly. And so like a lot can change in a handful of years. One of the things that does seem obvious, like one of the job categories that is being created right now, is machine learning systems, which is sort of the preponderance of the AI that we're talking about, have to be taught. So in order for them to do a task, a human being in some shape, form, or fashion has to teach the algorithm how to do work. And a lot of that with supervised machine learning comes in terms of labeling data. So the simplest way to get your head wrapped around this is to just sort of imagine if you want to build a machine learning system to do object recognition in images. You want to be able to label all of the fire engines and kittens in images. Then the way supervised machine learning works is you would have to go get a whole bunch of images, and you would have to like have human beings determine which of those images had fire engines and which had kittens in them, and you would want all different colors of fur types and breeds of cats under all sorts of different lighting conditions and backgrounds, and sort of the same thing for the fire engines. And so you have to produce a very large amount of this labeled training data in order to teach the model how to do this image recognition task. And there are a whole bunch of companies now that are doing exactly this in specialized domains. So like they're There's startups that do nothing other than help with data preparation for machine learning systems that are being used in autonomous driving. Like there are whole ecosystems, in China, for instance, that are dedicated to sort of image and data labeling for these supervised machine learning systems. My opinion, and like what we can see in our own research and like what we've been developing in Microsoft over the past few years, is that you're going to have a richer set of machine teaching mechanisms than just labeling. Labeling is sort of like it's robotic work in and of itself. It's maybe not the most fulfilling thing in the world. But like there are all sorts of like very interesting things happening with machine teaching itself, where you have tools where human beings in a richer way can convey the semantics of the problem that they're trying to, or they want the machine to solve, to the machine. And honestly, I think it's one of the most exciting things about AI in general. So if you think about harnessing a computer's power to help you solve a problem, the predominant way that you do that now, if it's a brand new problem, is you have to be a programmer. And it's getting easier to be a programmer for sure, but it still requires you to basically get your head wrapped around the idiosyncrasies of computers, and then to learn how to translate a human understanding of a problem into terms that a computer can use to solve the problem on your behalf. With machine teaching, like you are no longer programming the machine, you're teaching the machine. And I would argue that all of us know how to teach the concepts that are in our head to other folks. Like even a 2-year-old child can teach another toddler how to do things. It seems to be one of those innate things that human beings understand how to do. And so I think that also is just sort of an exciting thing that is going to open up a bunch of opportunities and make using computers and digital technology to solve problems even more accessible than it is right now, where we have 30-40 million professional programmers in the world. Like maybe we can have 300 or 400 million machine teachers in the world, like doing very, very interesting things. And that's an interesting prospect to me.
One of the questions we've gotten from the audience has to do with very much with what you were just saying, Kevin, which is the idea of democratizing AI. This is something that both of you are working on in your respective roles. Could you maybe each of you talk a little bit about what that means? This is a non-US citizen sort of saying, what does democratizing AI mean? What is a citizen developer?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that first. So I one of the really interesting things for me when I wrote the book, gave me the opportunity to sort of reflect back on the past 15, 16 years. And like one of the things that I noticed that I hadn't been paying close enough attention to is that very first machine learning project that I did required me to sit down with a stack of like intimidating graduate textbooks on statistical machine learning and a stack of research papers. And then I spent 6 months writing a bunch of fairly low level code to go solve this problem with the tools of machine learning. If I look at that project that I did back then, and then I sort of look at all of the open source machine learning tools that are available and the power of the public cloud and all of the training materials that are available on sort of YouTube and on the internet, like my guess is that a motivated high school student could do that same project in a weekend. And so I think in a sense, like the AI tools are already becoming very quickly democratized, like they are easier than ever to use. And then, the thing that I would say for rural communities and for, sort of places that are less connected than Silicon Valley maybe, is that a lot of the things that we need to do to democratize access to these tools is about access. It's not about the power of the tools. It's, do you have an internet connection. And, we're sort of in the United States in this shameful state where 25 million people across the country still don't have access to adequate broadband. And part of it is about like getting kids educated early enough. Like I think we have these, this belief that AI and machine learning are arcane technologies, when really in some ways they're easier to use than traditional programming tools, and are easier to teach to kids than traditional computer science. And then like part of it, I think, is role models. This is something that I suspect all of us have observed, is like when you're a kid sitting in one of these communities that, has a bunch of its own traditions and an economy that has, a particular set of momentum, and like nobody in your community is doing computer science or software, or, much less machine learning. Like how do you as a kid imagine that this is something that might be interesting that you want to do with your life? So I don't know whether you have thoughts on that as well, JD.
Yeah, the way I think about this democratizing technology question is, if you consider the early 20th century, you can make a pretty good argument that some of the most innovative companies in our country were auto manufacturers. And if you think about the early 21st century, the most innovative companies are very often Silicon Valley tech companies. And there's this weird way in which, for an early 20th century citizen, both as a consumer, but also as a worker, as a community leader, you had greater access to these innovative institutions. People up and down the education and class ladder were working at these companies. They were very much firmly planted in communities all across the country. They weren't just in a couple of geographies. And that obviously has changed a little bit. You've had this weird agglomeration where some of the most innovative companies, many of the most innovative companies, are incredibly concentrated. And what that creates, to Kevin's point about role models, is a world where the technology economy sort of happens to you. You observe it. Maybe if you use Facebook or Google, you consume it, but you never participate in it. You don't know anybody who works in these companies. You don't have any visibility to work in one of these companies or build one of these companies yourself over time. And I just don't think that's a durable way to build an economy. If the most significant and important economic institutions are basically cut off from millions of people because of where they live and how they think about their sort of economic opportunities, then I think that just creates a lot of instability in the economic and political system, which of course is in some ways what we've seen not just in our country but all over.
The thing that I will add there is that I think sometimes, so I completely agree with your assessment of the the sort of state of play right now. And I think sometimes people wrongly assume that the barrier to changing things, to like making it different than what it is that it's something about the technology. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's choices that we're making, because there's nothing stopping someone in Brookneal, Virginia, or Cincinnati, Ohio, or like, pick your community. If the caller, or the questioner was outside the United States, like no reason whatsoever that you can't pick up the tools of AI and like, open source software and the cloud. Like in some ways, it's never been easier to build a technology business, but like we do have to make a different set of choices, I think, about what we're investing in, how we're educating people, like how how we're sort of setting our set of collective expectations for like what a good future looks like for individuals. And like I just just to underline the point you made, like I very, very powerfully believe that you cannot have a sort of a stable democracy, or even a world that's getting the the best out of the collective brilliance of everyone, if you only have a small fraction of the population participating in the innovation economy.
Yep.
The title of the book uses the term American Dream, and a couple of our questioners have asked if you have your definition of American Dream. It can be vague, it can be cliche. It's been written about. I'd be interested in hearing from both of you. Your point.
So I will answer super quickly because I'm really interested to hear hear JD's version of this, because in a certain way one of the things that I loved about your book, JD, is like, I think it was a story about an American dream. But to me, like, I think the American dream is a little bit of a Rorschach test. Like, everybody sort of hears the phrase and then they sort of read into it what's in their imagination. For me, the American dream is about having a set of opportunities that you can avail yourself of to go achieve the things that you want to achieve for yourself, to like having the ability to see an interesting future for you or your family or your community, and like feel like there aren't a set of systemic obstacles in your way preventing you from achieving that dream. And so like I grew up in this community of 250 people in rural central Virginia. There was 250 people in 1972 when I was born, and it's 250 people now. And my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my dad were all construction workers. And yet, I was born into a family that was very supportive of my curiosity. And even though we didn't have much money, like, they invested their time and energy into, sort of helping me satisfy that curiosity. Like, I had schools that for the most part were good enough, and then some opportunities educationally that were exceptional, like the Central Virginia Governor's School, where I went my senior year in high school, which is a science and technology magnet school. It was really one of the luckiest breaks in my life. And so, like, I didn't feel like things were easy, but I also didn't think that things were impossible. And I think that was a really important thing for me to have, that kept me pushing and pushing and pushing. So like a support network that said, you can do it, and like enough of a belief that what I was trying to do wasn't impossible. Like, I'd love to hear what you think about this, JD.
Yeah, it's definitely a Rorschach test, and so I'm sure my answer is going to be unsatisfactory to a lot of people. But I tend to think of it in sort of an economic bucket and a sociological one. And so, the economic version of the American dream is: do you have not wealth or a high amount of riches, but do you have enough prosperity that you don't feel like your life is just one precarious event after another? Do you look to the future and see some stability, some comfort, some opportunity for your kids? Or do you look to the future and say, I'm worried about how I'm going to pay all my bills. I'm worried about whether I'm going to be able to put food on the table. And that's sort of the material or economic one. I think the sociological one is even harder to define. But I tend to think that most people have a relatively common set of things that they want out of life, not sort of a specific job or specific interest, but I think they want, some work that's dignified and meaningful. I think they want respect from their community. And I think that people want to have a family life that's happy and healthy, and where they're not, again, worried about some of the basic, meeting some of the basic needs that come up from time to time. And when I sort of think about the American dream, and in my life, it was never sort of an elite education. It was never a lot of money. It was never a lot of sort of prestige or fame. It was always like, do I come home at the end of the day knowing that I did something that was meaningful at work, and that my family, when I get home, is well provided for, and we can have a good life together? Again, a very imperfect definition, but I think if you sort of asked 100 people what their answer is, you'd get 100 different responses, but you'd also find a lot in common.
Yep.
One of the questions that we have from a viewer is, what happens when education in rural areas doesn't keep up with urban centers? The issue isn't the 5% or 10% who will succeed no matter what, but those in the middle of the curve who don't receive the education to unlock their potential.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Although I wouldn't, I I'm not sure that the education system in the United States, at least, works great even in the urban locations. Like a bunch of the philanthropic work that my wife and our family foundation does is around educational equity here in Silicon Valley. And like you would think in Silicon Valley, like one of the most prosperous places on the planet Earth, with all of these brilliant people and high technology, would have uniformly great schools, and that is not the case. So I think this is one of the it's one of the most pressing needs of our time. I do feel like we're underinvested in education. I don't think it's necessarily for lack of dollars, although it might be. I know, like I can just anecdotally speaking, I can imagine myself as a kid now in 2020, like if I were the same 12-year-old now, in this decade of this new millennium, for the same amount of money that my parents were able to scrape by to buy, World Book encyclopedias, and the amount of time they spent schlepping me back and forth the 10 or 15 miles to the nearest public library, I would have been able to afford a laptop and a broadband connection, provided that I lived in a place that even had access to broadband. And if I had that, you are connected to, just overwhelmingly great set of educational resources if you are if you're self-motivated. But I realize that in and of itself is not good enough. Like the trick is how do you dock this wealth of knowledge that we have aggregated together online to the students who need it in ways that are sort of compelling. And I think we should be reimagining what our educational system looks like. We built the current system as a response to the needs of industrialization. We have to remember that our current system of education hasn't existed forever. It is mostly reaction to how do you get a literate, educated population who can participate in the 20th century industrial economy. We should be rethinking what that looks like for the 21st century and the sort of digital economy of the future. I don't know, JD, you had thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that framing, that we have very much an educational infrastructure that was built for a totally different economy than the one that we find ourselves with in 2020. This is such a big topic, and it's obviously something that much smarter and more dedicated and sort of people who spend their entire life working on education policy and educational achievement haven't figured out the answers to this. So I don't think that I will in a 30-second response to a question. But the only thing I'd add to what has already been said is there is this weird way in which we think we can sort of disconnect educational disadvantage and all the other things that are going on in a kid's life. And even, I have a 7-week-old at home and a 2.5-year-old at home. And nearly every day I am confronted with the fact that he has already advantages that I didn't have when I was a kid. And frankly, a lot of kids who are his age right now don't have as children. And you talk about, those sort of disadvantages compounding, those advantages compounding after year 4, after year 5 of life. And then we get these kids in school and we find it turns out that a lot of kids are much further behind other kids. And we're sort of spending an entire, 12, 15-year educational cycle trying to catch people up. And I just think at a fundamental level, unless we appreciate that, you've got to look at what's going on at the home. You've got to appreciate what's going on before people even get to school. It's going to be really hard to fix some of these really, really big challenges. As unfortunately as so many things in life, things can get baked in pretty early, and it's sometimes tough to overcome, even if you do spend a lot of money and even if you do have a lot of smart people working on those challenges.
Yeah, and look, I think what you just said is so incredibly important. It's one of the things that wasn't obvious to us when we started our family foundation that we understand very well now, that you have to sort of look at education holistically. Even things like with young kids, access to nutrition becomes a big thing. And it's one of the things about this current, pandemic that we're experiencing right now that, that I'm honestly worried about. Like some of these inequities are like showing up in a pretty serious way. Like there are a bunch of kids who don't have access to adequate nutrition except through programs at their schools. And so when school is canceled, like what do they do? This connectivity issue is like really, really serious for kids. So, I have children who are attending school virtually right now, which is, an inconvenience for two working parents, but like, thank God that they have it. And like, I'm deeply worried about all the children who don't have that, who, either because their schools don't have the resources or they don't have an internet connection or, like a tablet or a computer at home that they can't access the educational resource. And it has nothing to do with the ability of the students. It's like those are legit structural things.
Yep.
We're joined by hundreds of people around the world. Just Kevin, we've got a note from someone in Lynchburg, Virginia, who says that he or she grew up across the street from Dr. Siegler of Lynchburg College. So
nice.
Greetings from Lynchburg. With people from Iceland and China and other places writing in. We've been focused on the U.S. One of the questions has to do with, are you seeing anything promising in other countries in terms of the development of AI, the development of the workforce for AI that is fitting your thesis of equitable opportunity?
Yeah, I think you see signs in a bunch of different places, and just sort of encouragement on a bunch of different fronts. Like I won't talk too much about China because I think a lot has been written about how well entrepreneurship and innovation is happening in China. But we even like at Microsoft, we've recently made a bunch of investments in Africa, so in Nigeria and in Kenya, where we have just identified these brilliant communities of African engineers and have invested in development centers there. And some of the things that they're doing are using machine learning and like these fairly advanced tools to build products that serve customers across the world, as well as just sort of reflect on the needs of communities in Africa. Like again, this connectivity thing is such an important point. So Satya is Bill Gates started this tradition at Microsoft where he had this role called the technical advisor or the technical assistant. And so like Bill always had a TA that would help him dig into these deep technology issues. And so like Satya also has TAs, and his his previous TA was a native of Ghana, and like one of the insights that that Hoop had was that the connectivity issues in his own community, like he couldn't adequately share photos of his kids who were born and growing up in the Seattle area with his family back in Ghana because data rates were too high. And again, some of the same wireless broadband technology that we're building, can be deployed in those communities to help solve some of those problems. But again, like you can't really have folks participating in fully. And like, I don't mean like participation isn't just consumption, it is like also creation if they're not connected. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of promising stuff that's happening. JD, are you seeing anything outside the US?
Yeah, it's not really my area, so I don't think I have much to add to what Kevin said. I mean, obviously the Chinese experience suggests that with pretty aggressive state policy, you can create population centers that are pretty prepared to create and innovate in AI. I do sometimes worry when I think about the American experience that we are not thinking as constructively long term about how to ensure that we actually stay ahead of all of this AI technology. So I don't have much to add. I think the Chinese experience is pretty well rehearsed. I think Kevin knows the rest of the world much better than I do.
Kevin, our friend Link Kroger, who we spent time with at the Jefferson Forge in Iowa, has a question here for both of you about how should entrepreneurs and leaders in rural areas engage with, everyone from leaders of large companies who are looking to expand, or even political leadership to advocate for economic development in rural areas.
You want to take the first shot at that, JD?
Sure.
So JD, the question is, and maybe you've seen some of this in some of the towns and cities that you visited. What is the role of advocacy for people in rural areas, people who are either startups or entrepreneurs? How can they advocate?
Yeah, I think I've seen a few things. I mean, one, the point that Kevin raised about broadband connection is really important. You still do have about 10% of the country that's pretty far behind, though we've seen some interesting, partnerships between nonprofit leaders, industry, even church groups that have tried to sort of solve the rural broadband issue and encourage people to get, resources in their communities. I definitely see a pretty wide variation in the way that local government responds to this question of startups and innovation. You have some people who just aren't thinking about it or caring about it at all. We've seen some pretty interesting stuff, for example, in Birmingham, where they've created this entire sort of full service innovation district in downtown Birmingham that's made it a lot easier for investors, for entrepreneurs, for technologists to sort of meet and congregate together. And, what I often tell people is that, there are a lot of things to complain about and criticize in Silicon Valley, but what is really true is that Silicon Valley has benefited from these amazing agglomeration effects, that you can't walk down the street in downtown Palo Alto without running into somebody who's building something interesting, who's working on a fascinating research project at their university, who's trying to invest in breakthrough technologies. And that network density, unfortunately, in a place, even where I live in Cincinnati, which is obviously a big city, but isn't comparable in density to the Bay Area, you have to sort of cultivate that sense of network effect because it often doesn't come just naturally on its own, especially if you're talking about a very small community, a place much smaller than Cincinnati. So I always tell people, try to do as much as you can to connect the various people in academia, in investing, and in entrepreneurship, because some really interesting things come out of those conversations.
We've got only about 5 minutes remaining, and Kevin, I'll feel free to jump in there on anything you want to add, but I want to try to move us quickly through a few other questions.
Yeah, look, very briefly, I think the one thing that I will add to JD's response is that we are seeing right now in this gigantic work from home experiment that we're doing, that there are fewer and fewer good excuses for insisting that certain jobs like software development belong in a particular geography. We've sort of known this, open source, the open source movement has taught us a lot about how software development can be distributed. And we are learning that, right now the teams of people who are not physically proximate with one another, who are using tools like the one that we're having this video conference with, can be just as productive, maybe even more productive than teams of people who are sitting one another. And I think that presents a very, very interesting opportunity for, thinking about how you can have this work sort of spread out much more broadly throughout the country. Although, to JD's point, there are, after you've, bought and read Reprogramming the American Dream, like the next 2 books you should go buy, and like presumably you've already read JD's book. Like I don't think I need to help him sell more copies, but like there's this book called The New Geography of Jobs by Enrico Moretti, who's a Berkeley economist, that describes some of these agglomeration effects. And I think people should go read that book. Enrico's prognosis was pessimistic, but I think, because of technology, things could be changing, in a really interesting way over the next handful of years.
Important question here. Thank you to the speakers' insightful talk. I wonder how they have thought about increasing access to underrepresented populations, people of color, and the poor.
Yeah, I think so I can sort of say a few things that I've that we've done. For one of the things that I started when I was at LinkedIn, and I was sponsor of an equivalent program at Microsoft for a while that's now sort of graduated into a much bigger program, is that like we have to sort of look more broadly at folks as candidates for filling jobs that we have. So we built at LinkedIn a apprenticeship program where we changed the hiring process to be like, let's get a whole bunch of candidates in and like look as hard as humanly possible for reasons to say no to hiring this person, in this sort of meritocratic notion that like we've got to, have some sort of filter of quote unquote best, and we turn the problem into one of like, how can we find an excuse to say yes to like all of these candidates, like bring them into like a high paid apprenticeship program where they get on the job training and an opportunity after 6 months to convert into a full-time employee. And like the diversity of the candidates that we were able to bring in through that program was really incredible. It looked very different from the pool of candidates that came in through our normal recruiting process. And it's been such an amazing program to run. We've got an equivalent program at Microsoft called Leap that's also been like super effective. I think the other thing too is just sort of about geography. You can make opportunities available. Like some folks just don't want to be in Silicon Valley, or they can't be in Silicon Valley. And so if you make it possible to hire people into your company who are in different geographies, like you can get access to a more diverse population of people than those who are able to or choose to like be in Silicon Valley. And JD?
Yeah, the flip side of that networking point that I made earlier is that sometimes networks can be sort of constraining. And so, most of my time is spent looking at companies and investing in a few of them. And it's a pretty, almost a cliche adventure that it's better to have a warm introduction from somebody. But what that sometimes means is that you can sort of bake in your existing networks and never get outside of the people that you already know. And so, what we try to do is just be a little bit more proactive, both in sort of looking and talking to people who maybe aren't naturally in our network, but in my experience, more importantly, not just sort of passively accepting deals as they come into us, but going and finding what's interesting to us and proactively reaching out to those people, even if they're outside of our network. I think that's something you almost have to do if you want to, if you already have sort of a baked in network. You've got to go outside of that network if you want to find people who aren't as as traditionally represented in some of these companies and some of these spheres.
Yeah, I know LinkedIn, Kevin, has had a program as well to expand your network and to get communities of color involved. I want to ask one final question, and then Kevin, if you are willing and able, I'd like for you to read a little piece of the book as we go out. My question for you guys, if you could just maybe take 5 or 10 seconds. Empathy was a word we started to hear a lot about, JD, when your book came out in 2017. We're hearing a lot about empathy and the importance of empathy, Kevin, today as your book comes out in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. What parting wisdom do each of you have, having thought a lot about empathy for your communities, for the for the book that you've written for the folks that are listening today? JD, you
maybe I can answer, yeah, and then Kevin, you can go into your answer and reading an excerpt. I mean, my only advice and my only thought here is that as great as I think Kevin's book was, as great as I think my own is, there's really no substitute to actually getting out and talking to and spending time with people who aren't exactly like you. And I think that one of the big issues, one of the things I worry about in our country these days is, we're so divided along political, class, racial, geographic, demographic lines that it's very easy to sort of self-isolate in your own social circle. And if you want to build empathy, the best way is just to talk to people. You'll find that they're a lot more like you in important ways, and they have insights that you wouldn't have expected them to have if you'd only believed the caricature.
Yeah, and I think that's actually, if you want me to read this excerpt, Greg, like it's sort of exactly what it's about.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, please do.
So there's this disinterested, even disdainful attitude that people can sometimes have about those who choose to live in different places, who choose to pursue different paths in life. It's very easy to surround yourself with the same news sources, the same political views, the same entertainment, the same activities, and the same culture as everyone else around you. With modern technology, with more of our time spent online and on our devices, and with more and more of our connections with one another mediated by social network, it's hard to avoid becoming trapped in self-reinforcing filter bubbles and then not to have those bubbles exert their influence on other parts of our lives. Many of my friends and colleagues see those living in rural communities, people who live outside of the urban innovation centers where the economic engines are thrumming right now, in a very different light than I do. That's not just unfortunate, it's an impediment to making the American dream real for everyone. The folks I know in rural America are some of the hardest working, most entrepreneurial, cleverest folks around. They can do anything that they set their minds to and have the same hopes for their futures and the futures of their families and communities as those of us who live in Silicon Valley and other urban centers all do. They want their careers and their families to flourish just like everyone else. Where we choose to live shouldn't become a dividing line, an impediment to a good job and a promising future. That's the American dream, and it's on all of us to make sure that it works, because in a certain very real sense, if it doesn't work for all of us, it won't work for any of us.
Kevin, thank you for reading that. And JD, thank you for joining us. We had lots of questions that we were not able to get to. We hope you'll continue the discussion on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you all. And thanks, JD, for joining.
Yep. Thanks, Kevin. Take care.
Okay. Bye.